BLEED. In most video games, bleed is a status effect which deals damage over time, and that is what bleed also meant in Honkai Impact. But right now, bleed is also a damage type. Bleed is like a 5th element right now, or like a Pokemon secondary type. And this has caused some confusion among players, even more now that we have a lightning bleed DPS Lunar Vow and a dedicated bleed damage support Cosmic Expression. So, in this video, I am going to explain bleed status, bleed damage, and bleed support in Honkai Impact 3. In the past, when we say bleed, it usually refers to bleed status. Bleed status deals a certain amount of physical damage per second. It doesn't count as melee or ranged damage, and it cannot crit. Bleed status is used to activate some buffs or vulnerability effects. In version 5.8, Story Impression was added to the game. She brings a new type of buff, bleed damage buff. At that time, bleed damage buff was not as important because it only affected 2 damage. 1. Bleed status damage over time, and number 2. Some of SI attacks, which counted as bleed damage. Fast forward a year later, version 6.5 arrives, introducing us to Valkyrie Quicksand, the first bleed damage DPS. VQ is a physical DPS, but she has a special clause that says all her damage count as bleed damage. This bleed damage shares the unique bleed status traits mentioned before. It does not count as melee or ranged damage, and it cannot crit. What this means is that VQ can benefit from bleed damage buffs. So here is the difference between normal physical damage versus physical damage attacks that count as bleed damage. Normal physical damage can be affected by physical damage, total damage, crit damage buffs, and impair, bleach, etc. Meanwhile, Susanna and Cosmic Expression's physical damage attacks that count as bleed damage can be buffed by an extra multiplayer, bleed damage buffs. And as mentioned before, these attacks do not count as melee or ranged damage, and they cannot crit. Since Susanna cannot crit, the usual support stigma for Hush of Sentience and Hush of Rebirth are less optimal compared to Holmes and Aladdin 2-piece. There's more! Bleed Rider was changed and buffed bleed damage. Suddenly Susanna becomes a monster DPS. And then in version 7.0 we got Lunar Vow, a lightning DPS. Most of her attacks count as bleed damage, making her our second bleed DPS. Just like Susanna, the difference between Lunar Vow and other regular lightning DPS is that her attacks can be buffed by bleed damage buffs. During Lunar Vow release, some of you guys commented, Shadow Knight is also a lightning bleed Valk, not just Lunar Vow, and it is a sign that you guys don't understand how bleed damage works. Shadow Knight applies bleed status to activate her 50% total damage buff. She is still a lightning DPS. Meanwhile, Lunar Vow inflicts bleed status and most of her attacks count as bleed damage. She is both a lightning and bleed DPS. And now, in version 7.1, Cosmic Expression arrives as the first dedicated bleed damage support. Now here's one of the many confusions. In my beta videos, I called CE bleed support, and players are comparing her to the other bleed support, Story Impression. I apologize for the confusion, but to be fair, this is our first bleed damage support. So here is the difference between CE and SI. Story Impression is a physical damage support plus bleed status support. SI provides huge bleed trauma and increases max bleed stack. In terms of damage buff, SI provides mostly physical damage and some total damage buff. Cosmic Expression also provides bleed status support like SI, but in terms of damage buffs, CE provides huge bleed damage buff, plus some total damage, physical, and lightning damage buffs. Another point of view, usually SP supports buff one of the 4 main elements, plus some total damage buff. Cosmic Expression breaks this norm and provides huge bleed damage instead. Here is the summary of the bleed explanation. The complete Cosmic Expression guide will be in another video, so stay tuned for that. Hey, so I just want to add a note. Not all LV and CE attacks count as bleed damage, but don't worry, the attacks that deal most damage usually are bleed damage.